So thanks for joining us, Shana. So our first question was, how do you view the future of work and specifically the role of women in the workplace changing as a result of COVID-19?
Well, and it's funny because I think it's partly kind of a loaded question, right? Nobody has a crystal ball as to what the future looks like. And I guess I look at it two ways. I think that the fact that we're doing more remotely and there's more an acceptance of kind of remote work and so forth in theory, provides a lot of flexibility for women. And well, I'm talking about working mothers and so forth, because otherwise there shouldn't be a distinction between women and men. So maybe that's the first point I would make. And so I see that as a positive. That being said, from everything that I've read and experienced over the last few months, I actually think that we're seeing kind of we're going backwards actually in terms of equal opportunities for women. What generally, and again, it's a generalization, but women do pick up more than 50% of the efforts in a household. And with reduced, daycare, with different, children, depending on where you're living, being educated at home, and the additional responsibilities, the things that you could outsource before are becoming much more harder to do now. And what we're seeing is actually a lot of women are either stopping their jobs or going to a more of a part-time basis, which I find extremely concerning, given really the developments that we've made in my generation and the generations before that. So maybe, as I said, you can look at it both ways. I think that there is a huge opportunity if we properly understand the differences and the dynamics that women have versus men, and we're realistic in terms of those differences, and find the right accommodations accordingly.
Yeah, that's great. Just to add on to that, do you find the pressure to be on more 24/7?
Where I am in my career, I wouldn't say that there is more pressure for me than what I had before. I'm, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't necessarily always the best at putting my phone down or my computer. And I've always done a lot in off hours, and that's how I managed my career, as well as having a family at the same time. So I don't find there's more pressure, but I do hear that from my teams and my staff. And I think it's becoming, there's not more difficult to disconnect, right? The day starts whenever you pick up your phone first and look at that first email until when you go to bed. And it was hard to create a difference with the speed of technology and all the developments we've had. It was already hard to create a distinction between kind of work life and home life, and the two were kind of overlapping each other more and more. Now I think it's that much more difficult, because you might leave the office or leave wherever you were working, and that physical leaving that space and entering into the new space, you might turn on things again, but then it's more conscious. You're making a conscious choice that you want to go back and return to work. Now there really isn't those, distinct lines unless you make them for yourself. And that takes a lot of character and kind of self-knowledge to be able to say, no, I'm shutting my computer now. Now is the time for me to do whatever else I want to do, be it play a game, go for a walk, exercise, etc. And the more that we're not going to restaurants, we're not going to movie theaters or whatever else. And some of those things would create those natural divides, and those aren't here right now. So I think it's just harder for people to create those, to not be online all the time. And it does come back to being able to say no. I think there's also, if I think back on my own career, without technology, without the other things that were, the challenges that we're facing now, I found it hard to say no and say that's enough, at the best of times. And I think it's just becoming more difficult rather than less. And what I try to do is encourage people to be really firm and say, and treat, their workday as a normal workday, and whatever hours they want to work, but be clear, I'm going to start at 8, I'm going to take a break at, 12 to 12:30 for lunch. And at X amount of time, I'm going to turn off my computer, and that's going to be I'm going to read a book or do something different. But it's easier said than done. Also, when you know you have a lot, sitting on your to-do list of things, that you've still got to tackle.
Yeah, I've heard some people implementing a fake commute almost in the mornings just to kind of go for a walk before, they have a meeting or, maybe do like a workout or something right after work. So it kind of feels like there's some kind of separation from space. Like you said, it's very difficult to separate your home life from work life.
And we've done a lot of surveys over the years at PwC where we've looked at how productive are people over a certain, over an 8-hour day or whatever the course is. And, in all the analyses that we've done, if you have, teams working, for several nights on end till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning for a deadline, the extra time that they're staying working is really not productive time. So all those hours, your day is extended, but it doesn't mean you're that much more productive over that period of time. And I think it's having people realize, and realize for ourselves, at what point is it kind of the law of diminishing returns? You could spend another 4 hours getting another 10 minutes worth of productivity, and it's better to get some good rest and come, and look at whatever you're looking at afresh and anew. And that's challenging with deadlines and everything else, but it's easy for me to sit here and say, would I do, or what do I think is best versus, the actuality. But I do think at least having a recognition and understanding what are your best times of day, what are your down spots, what can you do to re-energize yourself is important. And maybe just going back to your question on women in the workplace as well, the other challenge that I see is if you look at career growth and development, part of that is output, let's say what you actually are able to accomplish. But a lot of it is getting in touch with different people, the connections that you make, the networks and some of the less official types of, discussions that you have, all those things are really instrumental to career growth and so forth. And right now, what I see is most of our meetings we logged on, even, ourselves, we logged on, we said hello, and that was the end of the chit chat. And we immediately jumped into the topic at hand and, addressing the questions or whatever technical topic and, what's on the agenda for the meeting. So you don't have a lot of space for some of those more informal conversations that are really instrumental to career development. And then added to that, and this is where I bring in women, again, generalizing, women oftentimes are, do a lot behind the scenes. A lot of the things that they're able to do and contribute aren't necessarily seen and recognized by their peers or by whoever is, evaluating them and supporting them. So it becomes that much more important for them to find other avenues, not just to accomplish, what the tasks are for today, but where do they want their career to go? What are the things that they need to do to be able to get there? And whom do they need to have, different conversations with and so forth, or have stretch assignments or whatever the case is, that they're able to, get recognition, and exposure for some of the other areas. And I see that is generally just a challenge for women versus men. And I think that the current environment just, again, makes that more difficult to do.
That's a really good point. So I have 2 more questions.
Of course. Yeah.
So another one is, get your opinion on what younger professional males in the work or men in the workplace can do to ensure an equitable workplace and careers for men and women.
I think the first is, like, we do a lot of bias training and so forth. It just, even understanding where are your biases and understanding the differences and qualities of which different genders, or you can go more diverse in terms of different ethnicities and so forth, bring to the table, right? So oftentimes, like, what are the skills that we really value in leadership? And if we value that, type A, strong-willed personality, that might not necessarily, prove to be the best qualities for the best leaders. And I think we need different types of skills and so forth. I don't think there is one size fits all. I believe that you have different leaders, in different organizations at different times, depending on what the need is. So as I said, the first is understanding your biases and understanding differences in terms of how people operate and what they bring to the table. Then the second is for, maybe you said younger people, but as you move up the ranks and you're in a position that you can evaluate or support somebody for promotion, are you being thoughtful and as fair as you can be in that process? So what we often do is we put all of our staff up, in terms of promotion, in terms of evaluation metrics and so forth. And then we take a step back and we say, if we look, we have, I don't know, more as a percentage, we have more males that are up for promotion this year than females. For example, is that right? Have we not necessarily recognized some of the contributions that our female staff have been, able to provide, or is this really the right answer and, where things should end up? So the fact that we go back and think about that, look at the numbers and so forth, and at least challenge ourselves is the first place. So, and I do that all the time. I wonder, am I supporting someone because I like them more, because they're easier to work with? Or am I really putting someone forward because I think that they deserve that opportunity, or whatever the case might be? And none of us are perfect. We're human. These are human constraints and human systems that we create for ourselves. But being mindful and aware is the first step. And then you can choose what you want to do with that awareness. The second, going back to what I started with, is for any young males in relationships or marriages and so forth, really being there to support their spouses or their girlfriends or whatever the case might be, to really put themselves forward, right? And take whatever, every situation, every relationship is different. I don't think you can sit on the sidelines and say, this is the perfect scenario, but having an open conversation and determining whose career is moving forward at which rate, and how are you going to manage the different dynamics, that create opportunities for both, is the right conversation to have. And then you can decide, what you both feel comfortable with and so forth. But I think that makes a big difference as well. I generally see more, we have equal numbers of women up until our kind of manager level. And then you see more women holding themselves back and pulling out. And the question is, why are they doing that? Is it really a choice? And do they realize that there are opportunities out there and they just might need to come up with a different way of doing things that they're comfortable with, but they need to have the support at home or, in other relationships as well.
Yep, setting up for success and having that balance between work life.
Yeah. And I think, as I said, I think you have to recognize, which skills are, where can you find complementary skills? So if I think of we talk about diversity, a diverse team really being strong. That's not all women on a team or all men on a team or all, one ethnicity. And where I've seen teams really work together is where they complement each other, where you don't want two people with exactly the same skills and the same strengths, because then you're just kind of reinforcing the same thing, right? Where I look for teams or I look for people to work with that complement or are maybe the opposite of what my strengths are. Because where I have weaknesses, if they can bring that to the table, then together we really form a strong team. I'm not good at everything. Nobody is good at everything. And recognizing what you're best at, what are your strengths, and also being honest about your weaknesses and your areas for development, but then looking for counterparts that you can work with that complement each other, I think raises the bar as a whole.
That's a good way of looking at it. So last question I have, and I think we've only got 9 minutes left, so
I have a bit of flexibility. So
okay. So next question. COVID-19 has impacted working women more than men. Is your organization taking steps to ensure that the increased load on women, especially those with young children, is taking into consideration for workload and performance evaluation?
Yeah, so we talked about this actually when we had our last webcast and our last, meeting, and it triggered me given everything that I've read and been seeing lately. I do think we're mindful. By the way, I think we were mindful before COVID as well. We're trying to do what we can to support the women and within our organization as well. But I also think that there is, I think it is, after our call, I went back and I said, what are we doing in addition to be, recognizing where it might be harder and so forth. And I'm sitting here in the Netherlands where our for the first few months, it was extremely difficult. Daycares were closed, schools were closed. But now in that sense, life is back to normal. The daycare centers are open. The schools are still back to being open. So the responsibilities at home, at least, you can't outsource, or you have the opportunity to use other methods to support rather than having to do everything, being responsible for your child's education, their welfare, and everything else that you have going on at home. So I do think that's alleviated some of the pressure. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that, it continues to be a challenge, and we don't really know where the end is either. So we are trying to look at what we can do. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of evaluations, we already were doing quite a lot to try to create as much fairness and equity as we could do. So as I mentioned, we have these round tables where all of our staff at one grade level are evaluated together. Well, each of them are evaluated, and then we look at it on a statistical basis and across the whole population and challenge ourselves whether we've been really fair, and as unbiased as we can be in that evaluation process, and taking all the evaluations and so forth, or there is a metric, a KPI element, but a lot of it is still very qualitative and based on judgment. So if you get an evaluation from me, I might be a harder evaluator than the person next to me who's also doing an evaluation. So that's where we try to create as much equity as we can. And I think this is just yet another component that we're trying to take into account. But I was pleased that the university, it was something that I raised after our last call, and I was pleased to see the steps that the university was taking. I do think that it will require an extra push from companies beyond what we were already doing, and it was already a challenge to create more equity and more diversity in our teams even before COVID hit. Now we have to be just that much more aware and cognizant, and I think having honest conversations. If somebody is struggling or trying to balance everything, I would hope that people are willing to reach out and have those conversations, because if you're not discussing it, then there's no, it's really hard to understand what are the different dynamics in each individual's lives and what they're dealing with as well. Mm-hmm. But we will have to look at the trends, and that you can do from the numbers and looking at analytics and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I don't have any more questions, but is there anything else you wanted to add on about general trends that you're seeing, or maybe specifically in your industry, what you've seen like right now?
Well, I guess you can see, it's interesting to see our leaders in each of the country, in each country around the world dealing with a crisis like this in different ways. The crisis is global. We're all facing kind of the same things. There are differences by country, but observing how decisions are made, how they're communicated, how do you bring a population along with you is interesting to watch. And what I do see, and I see this as positive, is a lot of the strengths that, I hate to generalize, but that women bring to the table in terms of their leadership styles has been really valued at this time, right? There's an honesty in terms of the communication rather than sugarcoating things. Most of the communication has been, this is where we are. we're faced with some difficult decisions. There is no right answer, unfortunately, but we've done a lot of analysis and looking at the facts. And, for these reasons, we're coming to the decision we have been. But I do think that a humility and a recognition and honesty that there is no silver bullet and we don't have all the answers out there is what we're seeing, in a lot of female leadership. And I see that as extremely positive. And I applaud that when I see that at companies as well. I do think that to get through this crisis and to come out stronger, it will require it will require governments, but it also will require businesses to really work together to take us to the future. If you can't put all of the responsibility onto a government, to solve the economic issues that we're also facing right now. And I think the private sector also can play a very valuable role. And, so far, there's differences. There are companies who have just tried to survive, right? And they're in a precarious situation. There are companies that have, been very successful and benefited and are really investing into the future. And then there's a number in between. But the companies that are at least in a financial position that they can really move forward on their strategy and be forward looking rather than short term focused, be long term focused, which again tends to be more of a female attribute, are the ones that I think that will be most successful and ultimately will help our society, get through this and move forward. But with every challenge, I think there's opportunities. The question is, how do we look at them and not look at the glass always as half full, but also look at, how do we take the experience, the learnings, the difficult learnings that we've had and use those for the future as well. That's, I guess, what I would find to be the biggest, the biggest shame is if we don't learn from, we don't learn from the challenges that we're facing right now and we repeat them in the future. I think that would be disappointing. And I think we have a huge opportunity there. Mm-hmm. And that comes back to the discussions we've had on diversity, comes back to, providing opportunities for women. And, what I talked about earlier is if you have knowing what we do know about, women putting themselves forward for roles and everything else, we're not meeting anybody at the coffee machine. We're not having those informal conversations. So when we're thinking about new opportunities for promotions, for new roles, are we really looking at the full picture of what our talent pool is? And are we pushing and supporting, again, women in our teams as well, on an equal or even more beneficial basis to provide those opportunities for them? And I think we have to look harder than we might have historically, because we don't have the normal aspects to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not seeing it like we normally would.
Yeah, as I said, I think it was already difficult, but it's that much more challenging. So whoever has talked to me last or talked to me several times today is at the top of my mind. So if I haven't reached out, then, to all my team members, the people working with, that I haven't spoken to recently are not necessarily top of mind. So I believe my responsibility is to reach out to them more proactively. My advice would be for any woman or anybody who's more shy and is less outgoing, that they also take this opportunity and say, I'm going to reach out, I'm going to make a phone call to my boss, my leader, whoever it is, and open some of those conversations. Everything's a two-way street, but the more that you can do that, you don't necessarily need an excuse to call. You don't need to set up, have an agenda. You can just say, I'm calling to check in. And doing some of that, I think, is really worthwhile and even more important and needed in these times.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I really appreciate how detailed you went in on the questions. Well, thank you so much.
You're most welcome.